The winter of 1944 arrived like a silent executioner, covering the forests of occupied France with a thick blanket of snow. Every frozen branch, every abandoned farmhouse, and every empty road seemed to whisper that survival had become a matter of luck rather than courage. The war had consumed Europe for years, leaving behind cities reduced to ashes and families torn apart forever. Yet hidden beneath this frozen landscape, another battle continued in complete secrecy. It was a war fought not only with rifles and explosives, but with whispered passwords, hidden maps, coded messages, and impossible choices. Among those risking everything every single day was 24-year-old Claire Beaumont, a young French resistance courier whose calm appearance concealed extraordinary determination. Before the war, Claire had dreamed of becoming a schoolteacher. She had spent her teenage years surrounded by books, believing that knowledge could change the world far more effectively than violence ever could. Those dreams disappeared the day German forces marched into her hometown. Within weeks, schools closed, neighbors vanished without explanation, and soldiers patrolled every street. Her father was arrested for distributing anti-occupation newspapers and never returned. Her older brother joined the resistance and disappeared somewhere in the mountains. Her mother died during an Allied bombing raid the following year, leaving Claire completely alone. Instead of surrendering to despair, she made a decision that would define the rest of her life. She would fight. Unlike many resistance fighters who carried rifles into the forests, Claire carried something far more dangerous: information, hidden inside the seams of her dresses, beneath the soles of her shoes, and even inside loaves of bread. She transported intelligence between resistance cells and Allied agents. Railway schedules, troop movements, supply routes, fuel depots, names of collaborators. Every tiny piece of information could save hundreds of lives. Every delivery meant crossing German checkpoints where a single mistake would lead to arrest. She quickly gained a reputation among resistance leaders. While others panicked under pressure, Claire remained remarkably calm. She could look directly into the eyes of a German officer while carrying documents that could have resulted in her immediate execution. She memorized dozens of false identities, forged travel permits, and coded phrases. Sometimes she pretended to be a nurse. Other times she dressed as a widow, searching for relatives. Her greatest weapon was the assumption that no one suspected an ordinary young woman traveling alone. By the summer of 1944, Allied forces had landed in Normandy, and German commanders became increasingly desperate. Patrols doubled across occupied territories. Random searches became routine. Entire villages were questioned. The resistance suffered devastating losses as informants sold names for food, money, or simply their own survival. Claire was summoned to an abandoned vineyard outside Lyon. Hidden beneath the collapsed cellar waited 6 resistance leaders, gathered around a crude wooden table illuminated by a single lantern. Their commander, Marcel Laurent, unfolded a detailed military map across the table. "The Germans are relocating thousands of soldiers toward the eastern defenses," he whispered. Claire studied the colored markings. "If London receives these routes in time," Marcel continued, "the Allies can intercept entire convoys before they reinforce the front." He carefully removed a tiny roll of photographic film from inside his pocket watch. "Everything is here." Claire accepted it without hesitation. "When do I leave?" "Tonight." Another fighter looked uneasy. "The checkpoints are impossible now." Marcel nodded. Exactly why only Claire can do this. Nobody argued. Everyone understood the risk. If captured carrying that microfilm, Claire would never see another sunrise. Hours later, she boarded a crowded freight train disguised as a Red Cross volunteer. Snow drifted across the tracks as exhausted civilians packed themselves into freezing rail cars. German soldiers inspected passports, one passenger at a time. Claire slowed her breathing. She had practiced this moment hundreds of times. The forged identification papers felt almost weightless inside her coat. When the officer finally reached her seat, he barely looked up. "Purpose of travel?" "Medical supplies for displaced families." He examined her papers. His expression remained unreadable. For several endless seconds, the entire compartment became perfectly silent. Finally, he stamped the documents. "Proceed." Claire forced herself not to sigh with relief. The train continued through the frozen countryside. She had survived the first checkpoint. Unfortunately, it would not be the last. Near midnight, the train suddenly screeched to a halt. Passengers exchanged nervous glances. Outside, engines roared. Searchlights swept across the railway cars. Someone shouted in German. Another voice answered. Then came the unmistakable sound of military trucks surrounding the train. Claire peered cautiously through the frosted window. Dozens of German security troops were climbing aboard. This was not a routine inspection. Someone had betrayed the resistance. Officers began searching every compartment with extraordinary precision. Suitcases were opened. Clothing was thrown onto the floor. Hidden compartments inside the train itself were dismantled. Dogs barked continuously as handlers moved from passenger to passenger. The elderly woman, sitting beside Claire, quietly squeezed her hand. Neither spoke. Both understood exactly what was happening. A resistance network had been exposed. Now the Germans were hunting everyone connected to it. Claire considered destroying the microfilm immediately, but there was no opportunity. The soldiers were only 2 compartments away. She slipped the tiny roll deeper into the lining of her coat, praying the hurried stitches would remain unnoticed. The compartment door burst open. 3 armed soldiers entered. Behind them stood a tall Gestapo officer whose cold gray eyes missed nothing. He ordered every passenger to stand. One by one they were questioned. Names, occupations, destinations. Every answer was compared against lists carried by another officer. When Claire's turn arrived, she repeated the same identity she had memorized weeks earlier. The officer listened carefully. Then he smiled. It was not a friendly smile. It was the smile of someone who already knew the answer before asking the question. You are traveling alone? Yes. You work for the Red Cross? Yes. He stepped closer. So why? He asked quietly. Does the Real Red Cross nurse carrying these documents already sit in another compartment? Claire's heartbeat stopped. For the first time in years, she realized she had made a fatal mistake. The forged identity she carried had somehow been duplicated. Someone inside the resistance had been feeding information directly to the Germans. Before she could react, soldiers seized both of her arms. Passengers looked away. No one dared interfere. The Gestapo officer carefully removed her travel papers. Then he searched her coat. His hands paused. He felt the unusual stitching inside the lining. Without speaking, he produced a small knife. One slow cut exposed the hidden compartment. The tiny roll of photographic film dropped into his waiting hand. Silence filled the compartment. The officer examined it briefly before slipping it into his pocket. Then he looked directly at Claire. His voice remained calm. I believe, he said, our journey together has just begun. The soldiers dragged her into the freezing night as snow continued falling around the motionless train. Behind her, frightened passengers watched through frosted windows, knowing there was nothing they could do. Claire disappeared into the darkness between rows of military trucks, uncertain whether dawn would ever come again. The military truck rolled through the frozen countryside with its headlights covered, allowing only narrow beams of light to cut through the darkness. Claire sat between 2 armed guards, her wrists secured with rough rope that dug into her skin every time the vehicle bounced over the uneven road. The cold was relentless. Snow drifted through the open canvas at the back of the truck, settling on the soldiers' uniforms and melting against Claire's coat. Neither guard spoke. The only sounds were the rumble of the engine, the crunch of tires over frozen ground, and the distant echo of artillery somewhere beyond the horizon. Claire forced herself to remain calm. Panic had no place in her work. Every resistance courier had accepted the possibility of capture long before undertaking the first mission. The organization trained its members to memorize only what they absolutely needed to know. They carried as little written information as possible. If captured, they were expected to reveal nothing that could endanger others. She replayed her last mission repeatedly in her mind, searching for the mistake that had led to her arrest. The forged identification papers had been flawless. The route had changed twice to avoid patrols. Only a handful of people knew she would board that particular train. Someone had betrayed them. The realization hurt more than the ropes around her wrists. Trust was the foundation of every resistance network. Once broken, entire organizations could collapse overnight. After nearly 2 hours, the truck passed through a series of steel gates, surrounded by tall fences topped with barbed wire. Searchlights swept across the compound, revealing rows of barracks, watchtowers, and parked military vehicles. Guards stood at every entrance, rifles slung across their shoulders as dogs barked from behind reinforced kennels. Claire was escorted into a stone administration building whose thick walls muffled the sounds of the outside world. The interior smelled of damp concrete, coal smoke, and wet uniforms. She was photographed, fingerprinted, and assigned a prisoner number. Her personal belongings were cataloged and placed into a wooden crate. The wedding ring that had belonged to her mother was removed from her finger, despite her quiet protest. A young clerk recorded everything with mechanical precision before another officer led her down a long corridor lined with heavy metal doors. Her cell measured little more than 3 paces across. A narrow cot stood against one wall beside a small wooden stool. High above, a tiny barred window admitted only a faint strip of moonlight. As the door slammed shut behind her, the metallic sound echoed through the corridor before fading into silence. For the first time since joining the resistance, Claire was completely alone. She sat on the edge of the cot and closed her eyes. Fear threatened to overwhelm her, but she refused to surrender to it. Instead, she remembered her father's final words before his arrest. "No prison can decide who you are. Only you can do that." Those words had carried her through every dangerous assignment. Tonight, they became more important than ever. The following morning, the heavy door opened without warning. A guard escorted Claire to a small office, where the same Gestapo officer from the train waited beside a table covered with files. He invited her to sit. "My name is Major Carl Weiss," he said evenly. "You are Claire Beaumont. That is your real name, isn't it?" Claire remained silent. Weiss opened one of the folders. "You attended university in Lyon before the occupation. Your father worked as a printer. Your brother disappeared in 1942. He paused, studying her expression. "We know much more than you think." Claire kept her face unreadable. The major continued, "I have no interest in unnecessary suffering. Wars end. Nations rebuild. Lives continue. Cooperation makes that process much easier." He slid a sheet of paper across the table. "Tell us the names of your contacts, and this can end quickly." Claire glanced at the blank page, but made no move to touch it. "I have nothing to tell you." Weiss sighed softly. "I expected that answer." He closed the folder. "Take her back." Over the next several days, the routine scarcely changed. Claire was questioned repeatedly about resistance activities, coded messages, supply routes, and Allied agents. Each interview followed the same pattern. Weiss presented fragments of information, hoping she would unknowingly confirm details by her reactions. Instead, Claire answered only basic questions about herself and denied any involvement with underground networks. Outside her cell, she noticed subtle signs that the camp held more than ordinary prisoners. Engineers, railway workers, teachers, and former police officers occasionally crossed the corridors under heavy guard. Many exchanged quick glances, but never spoke. Even in captivity, discipline remained essential. One rainy afternoon, while returning from another interrogation, Claire noticed an elderly maintenance worker repairing a damaged water pipe near the corridor. As she passed, he briefly looked up and quietly tapped his wrench 3 times against the floor before returning to his work. 3 taps. It was an old resistance recognition signal. Claire kept walking without acknowledging him. Hours later, while eating the evening meal, she found a tiny piece of folded paper hidden beneath the crust of her bread. It contained only 4 handwritten words. "You are not alone." Her heart raced. Someone inside the compound was part of an underground network. Despite the guards, despite the fences, despite the constant surveillance, resistance still existed. Claire carefully memorized the message before destroying it completely. For the first time since her capture, hope returned. She realized that surviving would not depend solely on endurance. It would depend on patience. And somewhere beyond the barbed wire, the war was still being fought.